action.
Hi, I'm Billy, and this is Show and Tell. I don't usually knit when I'm with you, but I'm going to try doing that today because today is a little bit about storytelling. You do know that this is a vintage knitting podcast, and I try and put together something each week for you. But today I wanted to hark back to my Ukrainian roots. Ukraine has been, unfortunately, in the news quite a bit of late, and I just thought I would share some personal things with you. So I guess before I get started, I should not forget to mention that you can find me on Ravelry and Instagram as billietoy, and later on when I edit this, I'll put it on the screen for you. Also, you might wonder what I'm knitting on. So I've shown you the slit neckline sweater that my next knit along is going to feature. And right now I cast on for both the sleeves on a size 1 needle, and then after the armband, it'll switch to a size 3. Can't wait for that to happen. But I'm going to attempt to do this. It's my first row, so the stitches, they're tiny to begin with, but the stitches are particularly difficult, as you know, on that very, very first row after the cast on. Anyway, let's get back to my Ukrainian story and why I'm so interested in vintage. I'm a very nostalgic person. And when I was in high school, I entered a storytelling contest. I really had never done anything like that before. I'd never done any kind of public speaking, at least not much. But worse than that, I really didn't have a story to tell. So I came up with the idea that my grandfather had some very interesting stories, which I had never heard, about how he came to this country. I really didn't know that much about my grandfather because I was born in Philadelphia, and he and my grandmother, those are my father's parents, lived in New York. So at best, I would see them once or twice a year, and I never really got to know them that well. But this gave me an opportunity to speak to him and to try and hear some of the stories that he had to share. And some of them were really fun, like when he worked in a hotel and one of his fellow workers was a German man, and they found rats in the bag of flour that they were supposed to be cooking with, and cockroaches, and they left them in for crunch. And he talked about the German man grabbing the rats by their tails and smacking their heads together to kill them, and other such stories. But more importantly, I learned a little bit more about my roots. So I knew that my grandfather was born in Bombay, India, which struck me as very strange because no one else in his immediate family was born there. They were all born in what then they called the Ukraine. Today we call it Ukraine. By the way, I want to stop here and I want to show you a map of the region of the world that I'm talking about. So bear with me. Okay, if you look for my cursor, that's Ukraine right there. This, as many of you may know, all of this large area is Russia, neighbors to Ukraine. So my grandfather's parents, that would be my great-grandparents, were born in a small village on the Black Sea, well, near the Black Sea, which is right here. Around 1869, the Suez Canal opened. That would be right here. Prior to that, anybody who wanted to go from Ukraine to India would have had to go all the way around the dark continent of Africa to arrive in India. After 1869, when they opened this little passageway right here from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, it enabled people to go from here across the Black Sea, across the Mediterranean, down here, and zip over to India. So people in my grandfather's extended family, his aunts and uncles, had left Ukraine earlier to set up businesses, not in Bombay, but in Calcutta. They summoned for other people in the family to come and help them. And it seems like my great grandparents were amongst the last to go. And they only made it as far as Bombay. I'm not sure of the story. Nobody really knows all the facts. We don't have any ship manifests, at least not yet, showing dates of their travel or anything like that. I've never seen a passport, because the years that we're talking about are when India was under British control. So it's not quite clear who's got the records. I've been working on trying to get my grandfather's birth certificate for decades now. So if anybody has any insight into how I might do that, please comment below, let me know. Also, it'd be interesting to know your family stories if you have something that's interesting like this. Anyway, I know that they were in Bombay in 1893 when my grandfather was born. How do I know that date? When he arrived in the United States, World War I was looming on the horizon, and I've seen his World War I draft card, and it has the date of his birth and the city of his birth to confirm what was already, widely known. My father was alive, and my grandfather would tell him stories. So, my father knew that his father was born in Bombay. I should say that another possible way before the opening of the Suez Canal to go from Ukraine to India would have been overland, but you'd be going through some pretty difficult terrain, mountains and so forth, and very hot climate in some of these places. So it's doubtful that they would have arrived in India by that route. I'm almost certain that they went through the Suez Canal and on. At some point, not too many years after my grandfather's birth, my great-grandparents headed back to Ukraine, perhaps because my great-great-grandfather was at that point elderly, maybe even dying or deceased, and maybe they had some family business that they had to settle. But the story does continue. After returning to Ukraine, then they went to what was Constantinople, now we know it as Istanbul, Turkey, and then through France and on to Ellis Island. This is a picture of my grandfather and his 4 brothers, and my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. This picture would have been taken in the United States, probably not too far from where I'm sitting right now, because they lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And although I wasn't born in New York, somehow I ended up in a neighborhood that's about a 10-minute walk from where they lived. And I'll put a link up in the corner to another little video that I made where I walked from residence to residence, showing all the different places where they lived during their time in Manhattan. Some of the buildings are still standing. For instance, the building where my father lived when he was first born. Some of them have unfortunately been torn down, but adjacent buildings resemble what they would have lived in. Some of the places where they lived were cold water flats. In fact, on one street, I show you a bathhouse where most likely they would have gone if they wanted to take a hot bath. One thing that started to fascinate me was the family tree. As you could see from that photograph, my grandfather had 4 siblings, and each of them had at least 1, sometimes 2 or 3 children. So I was very curious to know about all of my dad's first cousins and their offspring, who would be my second cousins. And actually, I've met mostly all, not all, but mostly all of my second cousins on all sides of my family. Family I'm talking about today, the Ukrainian side of my family, is my father's father's family. But obviously my father's mother's family and both of my mother's parents, there are different sets of relatives. And I've come to meet almost all of them, even some who have never lived in the United States. My father also was interested in family and the family tree, and he had been collecting little, bits of paper here and there where he would jot down certain relationships, I guess hoping that someday I might pick up the mantle and take interest in it, which after interviewing my grandfather for the storytelling competition, I was interested. So I wanted to know the birth order of each of his brothers. And I did the same thing for my other living grandparents. My mother's mother was one of 12 children. So that was really interesting to document who was born first, who was born in Europe, who was born when the family came to the United States, and who all of their children were. And while people are still alive, it's really easy to get this information. Once your elderly family members start moving on, it's much harder to gather this kind of information. So I'm glad I did it starting in my teens. But like my dad, I didn't have a way of really assembling this information that made sense. It wasn't until the advent of large spreadsheets that it became even possible to think about putting information on a continuous sheet, unless you were going to tape together dozens of loose leaf pages or 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. So there was one summer when our son said he didn't want to go away to summer camp. He wanted to stay home for the summer. And I just had visions of him being completely bored, climbing the walls and driving me nuts. So I said to him, okay, you can stay home, but I'm going to give you a project to work on and I will pay you because this is going to be like work. I'll pay you for the time that you put in. And what I wanted him to do was go through these bits of paper and start to digitize them, start to put them on some kind of an organization chart. Now you have to understand, my kid was very handy around a computer. He actually went on to get bachelor's and master's degree from MIT in computer science. But in middle school, he already was able to navigate very well. How do I get an organization chart? And he created individual boxes for each member of the family and connected them with lines showing here's the mother, here's the father, lines connecting, a line dropping down, showing each of the children. Well, I would say he did maybe 24 entries onto this when it was no longer interesting for him. And I relieved him of his duties and I took over the project. It took me, I don't even remember how long. It wasn't days. It had to be weeks of just chipping away at it. And as long as I was doing it, I included my husband's side of the family too, so that our son would be able to see each of his great grandparents, my 4 sets of great grandparents and my husband's 4 sets of great grandparents. He'd be able to see where everybody came from, when they were born. So I ended up having to interview my mother-in-law and my father-in-law to try and pull information out of them. And sometimes they didn't even know, and they would be calling cousins. This became a big family affair. But the upshot of this was I was able to have Staples print out for me a 17-foot long scroll of paper with small boxes indicating each person in our extended family. And I think there almost 1,000 names on this. And for most of the people, I know roughly when they were born. Sometimes I had to interpolate to figure out, but I use different bits of information to help me based on where somebody else was born, what country they might have been in, documents that I've seen. So I have a wealth of information about my family, and genealogy is something that I continue to be interested in. When I'm not knitting, you might find me researching someone in my family. My current project that I'm really devoting a lot of energy to is getting my hands on a birth certificate for my grandfather who was born in Bombay, that one. So I haven't mentioned anything about the sweater that I'm wearing. You might have also seen my session recently with the other knitters who were knitting the Schiaparelli Bowknot, but let me stand up and show you my completed Bowknot sweater. Now that I'm seeing it on screen, I might want to go back, and I haven't blocked it. I might want to add on. I knit these sleeves from the top down. I might want to lengthen these sleeves, but I improvised the pattern. The sleeves were straight. But on the cover of Elsa Schiaparelli's book, there was an image of somebody wearing a longer bell-shaped sleeve. And I thought, well, gee, that's interesting. I might like to do that. So I made that change. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I did have a little scare. The bottom was curling up, although I did put a row of single crochet along the bottom edge. So I just wet the lower portion to see if it would block out. And all of a sudden, all this beautiful tweed became solid black. So I sent a message to Rowan. I still haven't heard back from them, which is a little disappointing, but I was in a panic. I said to them, Rowan, I don't think I'm going to be able to sleep tonight. The whole reason I knit this sweater in this yarn was I wanted that tweedy effect. If I wanted a solid black sweater, I would have knit with perhaps a different yarn. I really wanted the tweed look, especially because I had the tweed look in the pink. Well, I haven't heard back from them, but the good news is that the tweed coloring did come back. It's not quite as dramatic as it was, but you can tell that it's tweed, and that was my only concern. So this knit up pretty quickly on, I think it's a size 5 needle using Rowan Felted Tweed, which is DK weight. It would have been finished much, much sooner if I hadn't redone the bow. I had a very different scale of the bow. This loop was much longer, and it just wasn't working for me. So multiple times, I think about 8 times, I ripped it back to somewhere up in here and redid it and reshaped it. And that cost me extra weeks of knitting. Otherwise, I probably would have finished this in, I would say, maybe 4 weeks. So if you're looking for something that's a pretty quick knit, I would recommend this. It's not difficult. The hardest part is the bow. And I imagine if you follow Lisa Stockie-Rand's chart to the letter, you're going to nail it the first time. I didn't follow her chart because I wanted to tweak it a little. I wanted this to be narrower than what she was showing because my shoulders are narrower. So I knew it was going to throw off the whole proportion of the bow. So I completely redid the bow. Also, I'm shorter than the sweater that she was calling for. So next up will be the knit along for the slit neckline sweater. And I've put information into the show notes where you can find out how to register for that. I'm gearing that more to a beginning knitter who really needs a lot of hand holding, and I will be there to support you all the way through from cast on to binding off. I'm working on the sweater now so I can get myself up to speed. And I see some of the areas that could be a little bit tricky, but mostly with vintage patterns, as many of you know, it's written for just one size. And a lot of people are not that size. So I will be helping everybody to overcome that obstacle and figure out a way of getting a size that's going to fit them and still maintain the integrity of the design. I don't have any yarn acquisitions to tell you about, but I do have an acquisition. Somebody in my knit-along group mentioned that she purchased silicone tubing that you could use in place of scrap yarn. What you do is you just stick this tubing onto your needle and then you can slide your stitches right onto it. I don't really want to do this because of my cast on. But this tubing, if you're going to order it, the place I got it from was called Knitting Cords on Etsy, and I'll put Erin's information in the show notes. She sells 3mm width and 2mm width. So be careful. If you're knitting on a size 1 needle like I am, you really want the thinner width. You just shove it on there and then you can slide your stitches off. The only con about these that I will say is they had a very strong odor. I'm in the process of airing them out. I think in time that odor will go away. I'm a big one for using baking soda. I put everything in baking soda to absorb odors. But I didn't want this to get caked up with the baking soda, so I just gently laid it on top of something that was on top of the baking soda. It didn't really work as effectively, but you could put them outside and let them air out for a week and I think they'd be okay. Anyway, that's my acquisition for this week. No yarn, no sash. So there you have it, finished object, work in progress, acquisitions, and I think that's it for now. Please comment below. I read every comment and I respond 99% of the time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. I hope you're enjoying my content. Please let your friends know I am nearing the magic 1,000 subscribers mark. So if any of you have not yet subscribed, please be sure to hit the subscribe button. And then don't forget to pop up the little bells and select the bell that has little jingles on it to be notified when I'm coming out with a new episode. And of course, it goes without saying, if you like this episode, please give it a thumbs up. That's it for now. See you next time. Stay well, stay safe.